Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Frances Stewart. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Elders Climate Action Education Committee. We're delighted to have you all join us tonight for the second in our summer workshop series on the power of personal stories. And we're especially delighted to have this session this evening facilitated by Caroline Levine. Caroline is the David and Kathleen Ryan Professor of the Humanities at Cornell University and the author of 3 books, The Serious Pleasures of Suspense, Provoking Democracy, Why We Need the Arts, and Forms, Whole, Rhythm, Hierarchy, and Network. Right now, she's working on a book about the role of the humanities in the climate crisis. So she's going to be getting us started with a talk on the power of stories, and then a breakout where you'll get to put into practice what you're learning. With that, I will turn it over to Caroline.
Great, thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here and to work with you all tonight or this afternoon, depending on where your time zone is. We're going to launch a little poll to start out with because I'd love to have a sense of how many of you already feel like you have a great climate story that you can tell if you were to go meet your legislator or talk to a major decision maker. Would you already know? So I'll let you answer the poll while I get started. I want to start by talking about, and I'm going to share my screen first. I want to start by talking about some of the challenges of telling stories about climate change. There are a bunch of different kinds of challenges I want to talk about. Then I'm going to ask for a volunteer and we'll work together to craft a good story together. And then we'll break into small groups, pairs, and I'll ask you to practice helping each other to develop a good story or to tell your already great story. So I study literature and my major field of expertise is narrative theory. That is how and why we tell stories. I've always been fascinated by the fact that pretty much every culture, all cultures to my knowledge, tell stories. And every culture passes down norms and lessons by way of these stories. So that's one of the ways in which we educate children is by way of stories. So new generations come up and learn the stories of the old. But also almost every modern profession also involves storytelling. So lawyers, doctors, certainly politicians, scientists, patients tell stories to doctors. So stories are part of our lives in all cultures, including our contemporary ones. And they're one of the most fundamental ways that I think people connect to shared values and work through complicated problems together. So what I want to start out with is, and thank you for answering the poll. I'm going to just get out of my full screen for a second so I can see it's about a third have a good story already and 2/3 are not sure. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my full screen here. It wants me to, I'm sorry, I'm fiddling with the results because the poll comes up right in the middle of my screen for me. So anyway, sorry, distracted by technology. So what I want to do is just to talk first about what makes a story in the first place, and just a definition that I've actually spent years coming up with, and it's a deceptively simple definition. So you'll think to yourselves, why do you need expertise in that? That's easy. So what makes a story a story? The answer is any account that unfolds over time, that connects events or experiences, or both. So any account that unfolds over time is a story. So the really crucial thing about what makes a story is some kind of change over time, some kind of development. It could even be movement through time where things don't change. So you can tell a story about how time is passing and nothing is changing, but it has to have that time passing piece of it. So the most classic stories, of course, are falling in love, where there's a development of a relationship between two people, going on a quest where you start in one place and you end up in another, There are certainly stories of loss, stories of personal development. They're always about change. That means that you can tell a story in lots of different contexts. You can tell a story in the news or in gossip or in literature or in movies or in history. Any account that changes over time tells us an account of change over time as a story. So for a long time, I was really interested in and struck by how hard it is to tell stories about climate change. So most stories that we tell are told on the human scale. They're about human events and experiences. And until recently, climate change was vast and abstract. So it was on the very minute scale, like the carbon atoms themselves that are invisible when they're emitted. It was on the vast scale of like species around the world. It was on the very long scale of millions of years of geological time and temperature. And one of the things that we know about audiences is that too much abstraction and too much fear can turn people off altogether. So I was really interested in the challenge of trying to tell stories when what we're trying to tell stories about are abstract and kind of terrifying. But now things have changed because now so much that we think about in terms of climate change is happening on the human scale, and lots of people are actually experiencing it. And I wish that wasn't the case. But what it does mean is that we can tell our personal stories, and they will be a powerful tool in politics. So, why are individual stories important? They're a smart way to communicate, I think, because lots of people in our culture don't want to act or don't feel motivated to act until something becomes personal to them. And so there's a lot of research in the psychology of climate change that shows that people respond better when they feel a personal connection to an issue and when it comes close to home. So the first reasons to tell personal stories are that they make a connection, they help people to make a connection, and they bring an experience close to home. So unlike those maps and charts of species and temperatures, they have this sense of being intimate in some way. A heartfelt story in our own moment also generally doesn't feel like propaganda or like ideology. And so it can help to make a connection across a political divide in a way that right now so many people are divided from each other and skeptical of science and skeptical of authorities and experts and parties, right? That to ground it in the personal is a way to draw interest and attention from people who might otherwise be skeptical or dismissive. The third reason is that stories stick. This is, I think, an interesting fact about them, that they tend to be much more memorable than statistics or scientific facts or arguments. I'm not sure why that's true, but it seems to be true that people are much more likely to remember a story than they are to remember, say, an abstract argument. So in one example, I was really struck a couple of years ago. My son, who was in the 7th grade at the time, was part of a group of kids who wrote to our local congressman to talk about why climate change mattered to them. And one child told a story about having spent his whole life visiting his grandma in Florida, and the coast where she lived was in danger. And he was worried that in the future he might not ever be able to go back there. And the congressman responded to that story, and the staffers also responded to it. They responded to the class by saying how much they were glad that they'd gotten these stories from the students, but also that one really stuck with them. And they wanted to mention that to this class, that the story had stuck. And it stuck with me too. And I heard it secondhand. So there's something about the ways that stories stick that seems to be a really powerful aspect of especially personal stories. Finally, what I think we're all trying to do is to motivate ourselves and others to take action to stop the worst of climate change. And it turns out that studies show that getting people to think about what they might lose in the future is a very powerful motivator. And so if you hear about something that I lost, let's say that was very precious to me, and you can relate to that and you can think, oh, I might someday lose that too, that can be a very powerful motivator for people. So that frame of possible loss, and I recognize that that's real and that could come for me, can be a real motivator. So those are some of the reasons why we should tell personal stories. And the first goal that I'd like us to take together today, to figure out together today, is some techniques for telling your own story. But before I get there, I want to mention two, I think, really important limits to personal storytelling that I think we should also think about while we're thinking about telling our own personal stories. So let me sketch those out for you first, and then we'll go to the project of actually telling a story. So one of the limitations is that I, and probably a lot of us who live in the United States, by no means all of us, but a lot of us, haven't felt the worst impacts of climate change yet. And so if I tell my personal story, I live in a pretty protected place. I live in Ithaca, New York. We've had some drought, we get some storms, but it hasn't been as intense as the wildfires in California or the hurricane in Puerto Rico. And it certainly isn't already threatening livelihoods and ways of life here yet. So if I tell my personal story, it's unlikely to be the story of the person who has been already most hurt by climate change. So I think a part of climate activism has to involve drawing stories out from other people, and particularly people who have been really hard hit by climate change. So I want to talk about not just telling our own stories, but participating in a process whereby we also draw stories out from others. And we can retell other stories and think about a kind of pool of shared stories that we have. It's also true that just barging in and telling your own story isn't always welcome. And so, especially if you're talking to somebody who's skeptical and doesn't want to hear that story. And studies show that people are most likely to listen after they've been listened to. So the process of telling your own story also should kind of come wrapped in a context in which you're thinking about the stories of the people you're talking to. And I want to show a short video about this. It's 4 minutes long. I show this to my classes and I find it useful and memorable. So it's just 4 minutes long. If you feel like you already know the lesson of this, you can tune out for a few minutes, but it's about why listening is one of the most important things we can do as part of climate action. And let me make sure please let me know if you can't hear the sound. I'm going to start it now.
Talking about climate change can be tough. I mean, it's not like something you can just casually bring up in conversation, but it's such a big, important topic. We can't just ignore it. And while you can't fix climate change all by yourself, you do have the power to affect the people in your life. So let's talk more about climate change. Here's how. First, think about all the things you want to say about climate change, and don't say them. Really. You see, if you just start going off on how bad climate change is, people are probably going to shut down. They may feel attacked and put up their guard. It doesn't matter how eloquent your words are. If the other person's not listening, there's no point. So here's the secret to talking about climate change. Listen. Listen to the other person. I know it sounds weird, but it's the most important part. You may think the goal is to convince the other person of your perspective, but that's going about it all wrong. The goal is just to have an actual conversation, and that only happens when people listen. So, how do you start? First of all, don't ambush people. Get permission first. If they're busy, no need to force it. Just try again another time. Distractions make talking hard, so it's okay to ask to shut devices off. Once you have their attention, start with a question about climate change. Remember to make it about them, not you. Ask about their thoughts and their perspective. When they start speaking, you have one job: just listen. Resist any urge to respond right away. And whatever you do, don't interrupt. This might be the hardest part, especially if you have strong feelings or if the other person is saying something that you disagree with. But trust me on this. Just listen and be open to what they're saying. Now, if the other person doesn't say much, that doesn't mean you can go, okay, they're done, my turn. It's not your turn until you learn something about the other person. So encourage them to say more by asking follow-up questions. Ask about personal experiences. No need to go into science or politics. Reflect back what you hear them say. Repeating and referring to their words lets them know that you are listening, that you care about their point of view. This makes them feel valued and safe. When you earn their trust, they will be more willing to open up and listen to you. So after they've shared their perspective, then ask if you can tell them about yours. Okay, now it's your turn. What will you say? Remember, the point is not to convince the other person of anything. If you try to do that, they may become defensive and stop listening. Just share what you personally think about climate change. You may not be a climate expert, but you are the expert on yourself. So tell your story. When did you start caring about climate change? What worries you the most? After you're done talking, ask what they think. Bring it back to them. And you guessed it, listen. That's what a conversation is, a two-way exchange of ideas. Go back and forth for as long as it feels right. Learn from one another. At the end, thank them for talking and say what you learned from them. This is important. Ending on a positive note makes it more likely that this conversation will happen again. You see, one little chat may not change anyone's life, but it opens the door to more climate conversations in the future. And that's how you build trust. Get others caring about climate change and make a long-term impact. You may be surprised how much you learn in the process too. So, what are you waiting for? Talk to someone about climate change. It may be one of the most important things you do.
All right, so, oops. Go back to my, here we go.
Miami's the city living ground zero.
Now I have to
I'm scared to imagine it
close
underwater.
my YouTube. Sorry, everybody. Okay, here we go. So it seems really important when we're talking about storytelling to be thinking not only about telling our own stories, but about listening to others and helping them to draw out their stories. So that's number one. So I'd like us to focus on telling our stories. I'd like us to focus on listening to and drawing out stories from others. And then there's another big challenge around telling personal stories that I'd like us to think about together. And that is that these stories usually stay on the scale of the individual. So they don't usually get us thinking about how to take collective action. I've been teaching courses on communicating climate change to Cornell students for a few years, and I'm always struck by how hard it is for them to think beyond the personal scale. So they make huge sacrifices for the climate. They give up meat, they don't drive cars, they recycle and compost, they dedicate their individual lives to a smaller carbon footprint, but they don't have models for political action on a larger scale. They hope, and then they often despair, that lots and lots of individual actions will add up to a real impact. But I've, as a result, ended up talking to them a lot about how to think a connection between the individual and the collective, how to think about moving from your own personal scale of the story that you might tell to connecting with lots of other people to take action. So I'd like us to do the same here, and that is to think about linking our individual stories to collective action. So we're going to tell our own stories, we're going to listen to other stories, and we're going to link our individual stories to collective action. So the first question, how do you tell your own story? What makes a really good climate story? Some of these are just general facts about storytelling, what makes good storytelling. You want to just focus on a couple of specific moments, 2, maybe 3, not more. So a really good story is has a clear arc, some kind of change, some kind of moment of transformation, a moment of recognition, how I got excited about climate change, how I suddenly realized climate change could affect me, why I was worried about climate change, some moments, some one or two moments that galvanized you or activated you or changed you in some way. You need to give your audience enough context to understand the situation, but not too much. So a story shouldn't be too long or too detailed or too digressive. You probably all heard about the phrase "the elevator pitch," right? The idea that you're in an elevator with a politician or a CEO, and you have a chance to, just the ride in the elevator is all the chance you have to tell your story. So to think about a minute and a half, I think that's about a good length for a climate story, right? Enough to build a picture, but without going too much into detail. This third piece of advice is one that I actually learned from the novel Jane Eyre. And I could go into detail about that at another point. But most readers of Jane Eyre really identify strongly with Jane, and they think of her as a very emotional character, but actually she doesn't dwell that much on her own emotions. She often withholds her own emotions and describes the situation. So there's a kind of art to giving enough of a context for people to understand your emotions, but not focusing too much attention on your experience. Instead, giving a description mostly of what happened and why it prompted those emotions, but not spending too much time with yourself. I don't know exactly why that works, but if you notice, if your friends say to you, "Oh, I had the worst day," and then they start telling you a story that's actually doesn't sound terribly tragic, you might turn off and not be as sympathetic as you would be if they said, "This morning when I was at the bus stop, the bus," whatever it is. I'm not going to be able to make up a good story on the fly, but a good story is often more descriptive. It shows you why an emotion would come up, but it doesn't necessarily dwell on the emotion itself. And finally, what I'd like us to do is to think about ending with an action. So a lot of stories don't do that. And I think we miss an opportunity when we don't end with an action. So telling a good climate story, I think, often has a conclusion where you give hope, or you invite people to join you, or you think about what might be done and you brainstorm with other people about where you might go next. Because coming to a conclusion in which you say, "Oh, and therefore I'm a total hypocrite," or "and therefore I'm so despairing about climate change," is actually going to prevent both you and your listener from taking action. So what I want to do is I'm going to tell you my own version of a climate story. I don't know that it's the best climate story in the world, but one of my students asked me this and I told it, and then she asked me to tell it again and in another context again. So I thought, okay, this has some kind of uptake, this story. And she said to me, what made you get involved, and what was the moment where you really got involved in climate activism? And I thought for a minute, and it was a moment in 2005, when my oldest child had just turned 1 and Hurricane Katrina was hitting New Orleans. And I was just riveted by the news. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The people who were trying to get away from the rising waters by climbing onto their roofs and waving SOS flags for help, 911 calls where people were dying and on the phone with the emergency callers. And what was most striking to me maybe was I had been to a conference in New Orleans a couple of years before, and there were people now taking refuge in that very convention center where I had kind of casually walked by publishers' bookstalls. And now people were dying there because they didn't have enough water and they didn't have medicines. And I'm holding my child and I'm watching TV and I'm seeing these parents in New Orleans with kids who don't have diapers and don't have water. And the parents can't even use the bathrooms themselves because they're broken. And then gunshots ring out and people have to take cover. And it feels like a mirror image of my own experience, but in a nightmare form. Like, what would be the worst version of holding my child? It's this. Then the last straw for me was when I learned that my government had gone to the Superdome and taken a British family out of the Superdome and flown them home. And I was like, seriously? You can save some white family, but you're leaving all these people of color to die in the Superdome at the same time. So I'm holding my kid, I'm watching these other moms on TV with no diapers, and then I'm seeing the president congratulate his team for doing a great job. And that was it. It was really a last straw. It was like, oh, the government is not gonna, it's not gonna do this by itself. It's not gonna take responsibility for us by itself. So that's when I got involved in the fight against climate change. And it took me a little while to find exactly which organizations I wanted to join, but eventually I joined the divestment movement. And last year, I'm very proud to report, we persuaded the Cornell Board of Trustees to divest our $3 billion endowment from fossil fuels. And now, as you can see from my screen, I'm working on my retirement fund, TIAA, which manages $1 trillion of retirement funds, and many of them invested in really destructive climate devastation. So I'd like you to come and join us in TIAA Divest if you're a TIAA participant, and if not, you might think about your own retirement funds and getting active in that if you're not already. Okay. So that was my climate story. As I was telling it, I thought, oh, maybe a few too many details. I could do with a few fewer details. It could get faster to the point. My student was really struck by the fact that I was a mom and I was identifying with other moms in this story. And that was what moved her most. But I'd like now to practice with you. I think the first thing I need is a volunteer. And that is, I'd really like to start with somebody who doesn't already have a great story to tell. So from the 2/3 of you who are either not sure or don't have it, because what I'd like to do is to start it out as just a conversation where I'm going to ask you some questions. And then as we build your answers, we can kind of see where the story is going. So we can help you to craft your own story by starting slow and easy, just asking a couple of questions. So who might be willing to be a guinea pig? I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second here so that we can see each other. Do I have any volunteers willing to, looks like Pat, is that your hand up, Pat Samples? Wonderful, thank you so much. Can you unmute yourself, or does the host have to unmute you? Ah, there we go, great. So hi, Pat.
Hi.
Would you like to just tell us a little bit about who you are and where you are?
I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota area.
Great.
I'm not sure what else to say, but
Are you retired? Are you working?
I'm working part-time.
Working part-time.
Work as a writer and a teacher, and coordinate some programs having to do with aging and climate action.
Oh, fantastic. Wonderful. So when did you start to get interested in climate action yourself?
I'm not sure. As you were talking, I was trying to think what I think I guess one of the major prompters for me is a very dear friend of mine who has multiple chemical sensitivities, and she lives just a horrendously limited life because she's kind of like the canary in the coal mine. She picks up on all of the pollutants and poisons and toxins in the community, and they affect her body in ways that have forced her to have to go on disability and to not be able to, live a normal life. She lives an extremely restricted life, and I care about her a great deal. And so the more she's talked about how she's helped me see how much these problems in our environment are literally damaging people's well-being.
Yeah, wow. So I feel like what's so moving about that is both her suffering and the fact that it's something really visceral entering her body, and you're close to that. You really feel how awful that is, how destructive that is, watching it go into your friend's body.
She educated me a lot about, so I've changed dramatically what products I use and you know, if I'm going to put something new in my house, that I'm going to make sure it doesn't have, you know, VOC paints and all that sort of thing. So I'm just so much more conscientious about the choices I make in my life, because I want to protect her health when she comes around me. That is kind of the first consideration. And then secondly, obviously taking care of, at first it was more like I was doing it for her. And she kept saying, but what about you? Don't you want to protect your health too? I finally started sinking in that, yeah, I guess, and you know, I have since learned I've had some physical problems myself that have been affected somewhat because of climate issues.
And so what made you decide to get involved in climate action? What prompted you to make that decision?
I think probably I'm not real clear about that. There's probably several prompters. Mostly it probably came around to a good friend of mine as well, who's been very, very involved in the Stop Line 3 efforts in Minnesota, and you know, has been willing to go to jail for that, and our kids have been willing to go to jail for that. And so just her enormous commitment and her continuing to share information with me has made me realize that there are things I can do. And I also just got so inspired by the Native people who are, you know, putting their lives on the line to take care of our earth. And I've done lots of reading of things that have got me thinking about it. So I think all of those have been factors.
I apologize for my dog barking in the background. I may, I may have to let her out. But so, Pat, what would it feel like to say, trying to think about whether this is a frame for you, but to say something like, for me, my climate story is a story of friendship and of the people I know and admire taking responsibility for each other and the planet. This really has both inspired and moved me, both their suffering and their willingness to sacrifice. Because I am really struck by how it's in both cases, both what you want to prevent is suffering to your friend, and what inspires you is a friend helping you to see. And so for you, this question of friendship seems really,
I like that.
Excuse me for a second. I'm gonna try to get my dog to stop barking. I'll be right back.
Okay.
I see she's being protective. Excuse me for that.
I really like the work that you're suggesting. That's really helpful.
So what if you were to, I'm gonna now push you a little bit to the next stage with this. And what if you were to practice telling that story and starting out by saying something about what friendship, I don't want you to say something abstract about friendship, but I want you to say something about a lifetime of caring about your friends and listening to them and learning from them. Is there some particular moment that you could capture that would bring that out for you, like even a childhood memory, or you know, what is it that why is friendship so important? I am putting you on the spot.
I'll just kind of play with some ideas and you can help me here.
Yeah,
but
sure, absolutely.
For me, my friendships are a real spiritual bond. I feel such a deep heart, deep spirit connection with my friends. And they really, you know, they really help me step up and be better people, a better person, I think. So my friends they inspire me, and they their care for me makes me, I guess I'm gonna keep circling back to inspire. I mean, I really do realize, particularly these two people, I get really inspired by the courage and the commitment they have to, to tell the truth and to be, they act from such deep love in the way that they care about the climate, even as they're taking care of their own interests at the same time.
And also taking care of you. I hear that too. I mean, to me,
Yeah.
this is very moving already, that that your friends, you feel a deep spiritual bond with your friends, and they help you to be a better person. And it
Mhm.
is their willingness to care for the planet, even to go to great lengths to care for others, but also to care for you, that is part of what inspires you. And so, if I were your congressperson, I would be already very moved, I have to say. Now, some of the people who get elected to Congress are not quite so easily moved, but I think you have the framework for a really, really moving way to talk about why climate change has been important, and how you might move to action. Um, what I think we should do now, and thank you, Pat, so much for being our first guinea pig in this story,
Mhm.
is to pair off, to go into breakout rooms with two people each. And I'm gonna share my screen again real quick here. Uh, and I'm gonna put some prompts up here for us to look at. We'll pair off in groups of two, and I'd like each of you to practice taking turns as one, the active listener, and the other, the storyteller. So, what Pat and I were just doing, where I was the listener, Pat was the storyteller. So the listener asks questions, and it would be great if those of you who already have good climate stories could be the listeners first, to prompt the other person to think of important events and turning points, asking questions like, what first got you concerned about climate change? What prompted you to join this group? When have you felt most intensely about this issue? What are you most worried about losing, and why? And just try to get people to think through what their values and their real motivations are. And once you have a kind of topic or a theme like friendship, the listener can ask some more follow-up questions like, oh, how might you shape this? Or what might you say in that story? Drawing out particularly moving or interesting moments. And then the storyteller has a chance to tell the story. That is, now I'm gonna practice actually telling my story. Here's how it goes. And then I hope all of you will end with an action that you might have taken or that you will take in the future, that could inspire your listener, and then switch places. So you have a chance to be, both the active listener and the storyteller. That I think might take a good 10 minutes each. So I'm thinking we should give you, maybe half an hour for this exercise, 15 minutes for each person to have a chance to be drawn out, and then to practice the story, and then to switch places. And then I'd love it if we come back to the larger group and have a couple of volunteers to tell their climate stories. And what I'd like it to be is that you don't volunteer your own story, but you volunteer the story of the other person when you think that person had just such a great climate story. So, Jen, do you want to put people into breakout groups? Shall I do that?
Yes, I have them all ready to go,
Oh,
actually.
fantastic.
So,
Wonderful. So the prompt is up here on the screen. If for some reason you're paired with somebody who's not there, who's disappeared from their screen for a little while, come back to us and we'll try to find your partner to do this this exercise with. And you can pop back to look at the prompt. I'll also put it in the chat. I'll put the steps in the chat so that you can see what the instructions are. So Jen, if you don't mind going ahead.
okay, let me just, I just noticed I need to move one person. So let's see. Okay, I'm opening the rooms right now.
Great. And I'm putting the questions in the chat, or the steps in the chat, if anybody needs them.
All right.
So-
I think we're all back.
We're back. Welcome back, everybody. I hope that was a good experience, and I'm eager for feedback. But what I'd really love is for one of you to volunteer your partner to tell their story because you thought it was so great. It looks like, Rick, you've got somebody to volunteer.
Yep, I want to volunteer Reva Freilich, who will share a story about how to overcome hopelessness.
Excellent. Reva. Are you still here?
Yes, I was hoping I wouldn't have to. Well, I was very lucky to be partnered with Rick Moody, and we had a very wonderful conversation, like great minds think alike. But he said he was impressed that I said, as far as when I moved to Alabama after I retired, that I became involved in several environmental organizations like the Sierra Club, the Fairhope Unitarian Fellowship, Citizens Climate Lobby, Mobile Baykeeper, and other organizations, Climate Reality Leadership Corps. But what the point is that I felt like, well, what can one person do? But I know from Greta Thunberg, one person can make a difference, and that really everyone should just reach out to your other environmental organizations and get involved. And thank you for this excellent class. I really learned a lot because I did it because I need to learn how to listen, and I think I'm learning. Thank you.
Well, you also are inspiring us with your words, so don't just listen, please. That was wonderful. Yeah, I think sometimes I'm just going to editorialize myself on the basis of what Reva just said. I feel like I sometimes think, oh, to make a change, I have to do all this heavy lifting myself, but there are all these organizations already out there, and we can just, give our hand to help them and really make a difference that way. And it's so much better than acting alone, but also you don't have to invent the whole thing, whole cloth. Wonderful, thank you. So I'd love another volunteer, someone who heard a really terrific climate story from their partner. Leslie?
All right, I will tell Lori's story. I won't be able to tell it as well as she. Lori moved into Washington State, sort of the middle part of the state, near the Columbia River in the early 90s. And in 1994, she woke up one morning and her town was surrounded on 3 sides by a fire. They were evacuated on a, whatever it is, number 3 evacuation. And it was just get in the car and get out. And it was terrifying. And the area was covered with smoke from July through October up until the winter snows began again. And she'd moved into Washington and she hadn't heard about this. And she asked friends and neighbors, and they said, this hasn't happened before. This isn't, this isn't the norm here. We don't know. And the more she looked, the more she found out that increased drought and other secondary effects from climate change on the West Coast were increasing the drought and raising temperatures, and was the likely cause of that fire. Well, in 2015, there was a fire burning right across the river from her. It took out 30 homes in less than an hour. And the embers were flying up and coming across the river. And she's, it's like if any of those embers land on, sticks and twigs and stuff like that, we could go up. And so seeing the fire impact of climate change and feeling its personal threat to her and her friends, she really, her husband was an engineer in the climate area and knew that. She began working in her UU church with the Green Sanctuary and really trying to work with people to develop ways of mitigating and creating resilience in frontline. And she has joined Elders Climate Action. And, you know, the terror of the fires remain. There, she can see the burn line from just a few weeks ago. So our own friends, our own neighbors, however many miles away they may be, are facing the threat of the destruction of all they know and love, their home, their place, their everything, because of climate change. And I didn't do Lori's story total justice, but that was my 2.5-minute version.
That's a wonderful version. And I'm curious, Leslie, do you think that you will remember that story?
Oh my God, yes. I mean, I work with people who live in California, and I ask them, you know, oh, fire 30 miles away. But having had a chance to talk to Lori one-on-one and hear her personal story of, you know, trying to get in the car and having the garage door not open and things like that, that sort of put me in the passenger seat with her, and I could really feel it.
And I really love, I mean, there are all kinds of ethical dangers with telling other people's stories, but I really love having a store of stories to tell, because sometimes the one that we have ourselves isn't the most motivating or the most relevant, but something that somebody has told you is. And I think as long as we try to do justice to the experience, it can be very powerful. And especially, I think for me too, the hearing stories about the speed of the fires, and actually Kathleen has a really terrifying story of the speed of the wildfires in California. Also, I think it's different from anything I've ever experienced, and so it's so powerful to hear the story of that kind of like the fire coming within seconds to put you in danger. Were there stories of the action that any of you took at the end that you feel like were particularly motivating or inspiring? Were there that call to action at the end of the story? Did anybody have a particularly good version of that? Libby.
Yes, I think Maxine has the perfect story of that. And I know that she's very active in Elders Climate Action. And so I was happy to get to meet with her and interview her. And I think that the punchline was perfect because she was already concerned. She has adult children who were involved with the environment. She has grandchildren. And so she was always concerned, and but the tide turned when she went to a rally in Boston one summer several years ago, and there were tables set up with different activities or groups that you could join, and Elders Climate Action was one of the tables, and Maxine had never heard of it, and it was new to her, and she said the minute she saw that it was about helping protect the future for the grandchildren, it spoke to her in a way that she knew she had to do something. She had to take action. And she went home and immediately started a chapter in Florida.
Wow.
So I think to me that's inspiring because, you know, just up and going home and starting a chapter takes a lot of chutzpah. And I know that that chapter is totally going and that she's very, very engaged and heavily involved with that. So I was inspired by her ability to do that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And the two pieces of that strike me the hardest are one that there was an organization that was out there that was really perfect, like that just spoke to her, deepest concerns. And that was the protecting the grandchildren. And then the other was that she did all the work of starting a whole chapter. That's huge and very inspiring. I think I'd like to just finish with gratitude to all of you for the work that you do and an encouragement and an excitement. You know, one of the things that some of you may have been following the Yale study on Americans' responses to climate change. And people have really changed their minds over the last 10 years. There are many fewer skeptics and dismissers and deniers than there were. And partly it's because people are telling their stories and because they're starting chapters and because they're meeting together. And so I'm really so thrilled to have had the chance to talk to all of you. And I am going to go to bed a little more hopeful than I usually do because I met you tonight. Oh, it looks like we have Maxine. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the Yale study. I don't remember the full title, but
Yeah.
when Libby was giving me some wonderful reflective listening to my story, and I was saying I wanted to meet with my congressperson in Florida, who I'm not sure is going to respond to my story, she said, what about if you included some data points that, you know, just about what's going on in Florida, just to sort of back up a little bit. And I mentioned, because I know about that Yale study, and I said that I was so pleased to see that the Yale study breaks down different states. And I know that in Florida, for instance, over 70% of the people believe that they believe in climate change, you know? And so it was interesting, Caroline, when you just brought it up, that I realized that that can be a very valuable add-on to a story if you need to have some real hard facts. And I also wanted to thank Libby publicly, wherever you are, Libby. I can't see you on the screen.
Right. I mean, when you're meeting with Congresspeople, particularly, to be able to say, you know, 60% of your constituents are alarmed about climate or concerned or alarmed about climate change is very powerful. And so I am totally with you on that. So Jen has very helpfully given us the Yale Climate Connection site. And on that site is the 6 Americas study, which shows change over time, how many people have moved away from being skeptical towards being concerned and alarmed. So thanks, everybody. Frances, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for an outstanding presentation. We really appreciate that very much. I'm sure everyone learned a lot that they're going to be able to make a part of their ongoing climate work. But this is not the end of the workshop series. We have one more workshop planned that we think you'll all find very enjoyable and useful. That's on the 25th of August in 2 weeks, called Writing for Change, How to Influence the Decisions That Matter Without Leaving Your Desk. So that's going to be by Sarah Spengeman, who is the Deputy Director of Communications for Energy Innovation. And I think you'll find that very, very interesting and useful. If you're finding these workshops useful, we would really appreciate a donation. That's really where Elders Climate Action gets the funds that we need to keep going. We don't have a big budget. We use it very efficiently, but we do need some. So anyone who feels a desire to donate, that would be deeply appreciated. Thank you all very much for coming, and have a great evening.
I dropped the feedback form link for our survey in the chat box. So please, please make sure you fill out our survey form. That's how we know how to build our programs and what we need to do to better serve our members. Also, I will be sending out a recording of this call tomorrow, and I'll include the link to the survey form. And I will also make sure I include a link to the first webinar as well. But you can always find the recordings on our website, eldersclimateaction.org. If you go to the resources tab and click on the video library, you'll see all of our video library there. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a fantastic evening. Thank you, Carolyn.